I wonder, what is your least favorite thing about your culture? I know that all cultures in this world have amazing things to offer, don't they? It's very exciting when we're surrounded by different cultures, but I'm sure that for each of us, there's things about our own cultures that annoy us or horrify us even. Now, I'm British, and in my opinion, one of the worst things about my culture, it's quite hard for me to talk about in public, is baked beans. I honestly don't understand why a team of supervillains got together and decided to invent Heinz tinned baked beans. They sort of, when you're doing the dishes after someone's eaten baked beans, the beans are floating around, you get them on your fingers, this is disgusting. I used to work in a kitchen in a pub, and every time the baked bean thing came, if someone had a cooked breakfast, I was like, I don't want to wash that. Disgusting. And even worse than that, they smell bad, and even worse than that, they give you or your spouse wind. Absolutely disgusting. But the worst part of it is that some people seem to think it's like a British delicacy. Baked beans, just don't understand. Anyway, obviously I'm joking. There are much worse things about British culture, and there are much worse things probably about all cultures across the world. I don't know what came to mind for you. I don't know whether you think of political corruption or greed or war or inequality or poverty. Well, as we've been saying this morning, we're going to spend the next 6 weeks looking at the book of Ruth. It's in the Old Testament, and this story is set against the backdrop of a society that has all of those things and more. We're going to see from the very first verse, and I've titled this sermon this as well, in the time when the judges ruled. We're going to see that this takes place during that time in Israel's history. When was that? Well, last week, if you remember, Dave spoke to us from Deuteronomy. He talked about Moses looking into the promised land, getting ready to hand over the reins to Joshua. Now, after that, after Moses died, Joshua led an amazing victory into the promised land. And the Israelites, God's people, settled there. Things were looking really good. Things were looking positive, promising, but the book of Judges tells us what happened next. Because instead of living how God had told them to, their society ended up being defined by war, by oppression, by inequality, by greed, by poverty. So the time when the judges ruled ended up being the bleakest time in Israel's history. But what we're going to see in Ruth is something radically different. Many of you who have read this book before, when you heard that we were doing Ruth, you might have had really fond memories of this book. Because in many ways, the book of Ruth showcases the best of humanity, doesn't it? If you've read it before, we see this amazing society where people follow God's law so that people are looked after. It shows a small picture of the sort of society that God intended his people to live in, not like what we see in the book of Judges. But before we jump in, I just need to give you a quick health warning, because some of you might have heard that we're doing Ruth. You might have thought, great, I'm going to come and get some dating advice, because this is like an ancient Israelite Cinderella story. It's going to be great. And if that was you, if you came here expecting some dating advice, I suggest really politely that you just go out the door at the back, because if you do lots of the things that you see in the book of Ruth, you might end up getting arrested. Now, this isn't a love story. Ruth is not a love story. That might surprise you. It's not a love story, but it is a story about love. Because it's a story about God. Because it's a story about God taking a truly broken family in a truly broken culture and bringing restoration and redemption to the entire world. That's why we've called this series Redemption and Restoration. And it all begins in the land of Israel, in the region of Judah, in a little town called Bethlehem, in a dark society that needed 3 things. And these 3 things are going to form our 3 points this morning. This culture needed satisfying, it needed subverting, and it needed saving. That might not make sense just yet. Hopefully, as we work through this morning, you'll get a taste of what's coming up over the next 6 weeks in the book of Ruth. So let's jump in. Firstly, culture needed satisfying. What I mean by that is that they were hungry. They were hungry in more than one way. So if you turn to verse 1, in the days when the judges ruled. We've talked a bit about this already. I'm not going to go into too much detail about what this means. But I do suggest that you have a little listen or read, however you access the Bible, to the end of the book of Judges. Just listen to the last couple of chapters and you'll get a sense of how horrendous this culture was. What happens in the book of Judges is it starts off bad, but over the course of the book, the Israelites just get worse and worse and worse and worse, until right at the end, the final verse says this. It says, in those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. Another translation says, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. That's the end of the book of Judges. It's very bleak. I wonder if this is familiar to us. I wonder if this is what we see sometimes when we put on the telly or when we open up a newspaper. Do we see a world where everyone just does what is right in their own eyes? Where people convince themselves that harming thousands and thousands of people isn't just kind of okay, but it's a morally good thing to do. Our mantra in our culture is you do you. Whatever you want to do, whatever you think is the right thing, whatever you think is true, whatever makes you happy, do that. As long as you're not harming anyone, do that. I think we can see, I spend a bit of time in my job looking at statistics, mental health data. I think if we have a 5-second glance at the statistics of mental health today, we can see that you do you, doing what is right in our own eyes, has left everybody hungry. Let's keep looking. In the days of the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, hunger. It's no surprise that this happened, because back in Deuteronomy, God makes it very clear that in the land, when the Israelites move into the land, if they don't follow God's law, then this sort of thing is going to happen. If they're not obedient to God, if they rebel against God, there's going to be natural disasters, there's going to be famine, there's going to be all sorts of nasty things. What this is called is a covenant curse. It's a complicated way of saying that disobedience will lead to curse. Disobedience will lead to things going wrong. If they don't keep their end of the deal, then it's not going to go well for them. The ground is going to be cursed. Quite a simple formula. Let's keep reading, though. It says, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. A man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, the wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Quick map. I couldn't get it to go any bigger than that. Quick map. Moab is that brown one over there, over to the east, and they came from Bethlehem. I'm sorry, it's quite small, isn't it? But Bethlehem's just up on the green bit that's Israel over there. So they came across to Moab, across the Jordan. Now, in the Old Testament times, for someone to leave the promised land, for someone to leave that green territory there and move somewhere else, was almost like saying they'd abandoned God. Now, we're not told explicitly whether what Elimelech did here is good or bad, but there's a bit of wordplay here in the original language. I'll just share a little bit. The name Bethlehem, we've all heard of Bethlehem, it's the Christmas story happens in Bethlehem. The name Bethlehem in Hebrew means house of bread. Did you know that? House of bread. So the irony is, in the first verse of Ruth, we see a man leaving house of bread in search of food. Ironic. It's not saying whether it's good or bad, but it is definitely ironic. And I think this sums up the period of the judges, doesn't it? Everybody was looking for satisfaction, for fullness, everywhere apart from in their God. People were spiritually hungry. They were leaving house of bread in search of food. It wasn't working. If you've ever seen The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or read the book by C.S. Lewis, at one point, one of the characters, Edmund, is given some Turkish delight by the villain, the White Witch. And it says in the book, the more he ate, the more he wanted to eat. What he doesn't know, what Edmund doesn't know, is that this is enchanted Turkish delight, and that anyone who had once tasted it would want more and more of it, and would, even if they were allowed, go on eating it until they killed themselves. You know, it's a kid's book. It's a bit dramatic, isn't it? But it makes a very good point, I think, because I think that's how lots of us live. Just a bit more money, I'll be happy. Just a little bit of a bigger house. Just a little bit more power. Just a little bit, not too much, just a little bit. A little promotion. If only I was a little bit more popular. Or if I had slightly better grades in school. Or if I was a little bit thinner or a little bit better looking. I don't think about that very often, I'm joking. But it's enchanted Turkish delight because when we get those things, we're still hungry. So if you're here today and you're hungry, you're in exactly the right place. Jesus is right here, ready to feed you. Don't do what Elimelech did. Don't leave house of bread in search of food, because trust me, there's nothing out there that can satisfy you. It's all enchanted Turkish delight. But this morning, Jesus says to us, he says, I am the bread of life. He says, I've got all that you need for true satisfaction. I pray that you can meet with him this morning. So, firstly, we've seen a hungry culture. But it was also a culture that needed subverting. That means to turn something upside down, to turn something on its head. Let's have a look at verse 2 again. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi. And the names of his two sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to Moab and lived there. So right here we meet Naomi. And she's immediately introduced as his wife. There's nothing surprising there. The people hearing this for the first time wouldn't have been shocked at that. She's introduced as his wife. That's how in a patriarchal culture, that's how you introduce the woman. The woman is introduced in relation to the man. But, let's keep reading. Verse 3, now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her two sons. It's weird, suddenly it's flipped. Elimelech is now defined as Naomi's husband. So suddenly the main character bursts onto the scene, and it's Naomi, it's a woman. This story is about her. And, never again in the book of Ruth, we'll see this, never again is she referred to as the wife of Elimelech. She is Naomi. That's who she is. So you finish the book of Judges, you see that verse, doom and gloom, everyone does what is right in their own eyes, everything's terrible. And then you turn the page, and bam, here's Naomi. We'll meet Ruth soon. Things are going to be different here. This is the first clue of what we're going to see in the rest of this little story. Because God is about to act in this broken culture. He's going to use these two women. Because while everyone else is doing what's right in their own eyes, these two women are going to say no. They're going to say there's a better way to live. We're going to see them living in a way that embodies the Hebrew word hesed. I'm going to explain what that means, don't panic. It's actually chesed from the back of your throat, but I'm not going to do that because bit of a sore throat today. Chesed, you can practice saying it at home. I've been teaching kids this in schools recently, and I've been trying to get them to go chesed, and they love it. Anyway, we're going to hear a lot about this word over the next 6 weeks. You're going to get really sick of it, I think. Hopefully not, but you might get a bit sick of it. Now, this is a word that comes up 250 times in the Old Testament, and 3 of those times are in the book of Ruth. Now, it's a word that can't really be translated properly into English because it means so many different things. So sometimes you'll see it translated as love, or faithfulness, or loyalty, or loving kindness, or just kindness sometimes. But it's much more than this. Much, much, much more. And it's a theme that weaves all the way through the book of Ruth. Because as I said, Ruth is not a love story, but it is a story about love. It's a story about a special kind of love called hesed. Hesed. So every week we're going to see the characters showing hesed as they make decisions that cost themselves but benefit others. Because hesed's the sort of love that makes people do ridiculous things to improve the lives of other people, even when that comes at a huge cost to themselves, or pain, or risk. We're going to see that hesed's a type of costly, self-sacrificial, loyal love that God is going to use to save the world. In the book of Ruth, we're going to see that each act of hesed is like a domino in a chain of dominoes. Each act inspires the next one until God has used his people to completely restore a family. We're going to see that God intends to restore his world through men and women made in his image, committed to hesed love. we're going to see a community who are so committed to it that the poor don't stay poor. That foreigners and refugees are accepted, adopted, loved. Where widows and orphans are provided for. Basically, what we're going to see is a community that embodies the very character of God. And I think this is what we want to see in our town, isn't it? I think we want to see God bringing restoration to Bury St Edmunds, don't we? You know, God is using our church to do it. There's people in this church who are working to help people out of poverty. We already heard about the community grocery earlier. There's people in this church who are supporting refugees. There's people in this church providing for children who can't access school through Bridge the Gap. God's bringing restoration to the people of our town, and he's using his church to do it. You know, everywhere I go, as I said before, I get the privilege of popping in and out of different schools, and people with absolutely no connection to church are saying, Bridge Community Church, that's where you go. That's the one that does Bridge the Gap. That's the one with the community grocery. They're seeing God loving his town through his people, through the acts of hesed of his people. So, hopefully in the first couple of verses, we see that things are going to be subverted. We see that this bleak time of the Judges is going to be turned on its head. We see that God is going to use his people to bring restoration and redemption. But we're not there yet. Because in our passage this morning, things are about to get worse. Because it's all well and good bringing counter-cultural acts of kindness, acts of hesed to restore a community, but this family, the society they live in, is going to need more than that. Because really, the people in the world need more than that. Because everyone that I've just mentioned needs saving. Back to verse 3. Now, Elimelech, Naomi's husband died. She was left with her two sons. Sorry, I'm reading it so many times. You'll get it right in your head. You'll be dreaming about it tonight. Now, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her two sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her two sons and her husband. This is really bad news, because in that culture, without sons, without men to look after her, Naomi's got absolutely nothing. A man would provide everything for a woman in that culture. So she can't just pop back to Bethlehem, get a studio flat above Tesco, get a job with Deliveroo. She can't do that. What can she do? Can she get herself out of this situation? No, she can't. What she needs, what Naomi needs, is someone to come along to show her kindness, to show her hesed. That's the only hope that she has. She needs saving. She's rescuing. Because the whole of Israel during the time of the Judges also needed saving. They just couldn't seem to get any better. As I said, if you read through the book of Judges, it just goes round and round and round. It's awful. It just gets worse and worse and worse. No matter how many times they make resolutions to get better, to follow God, they always get worse. It always goes wrong. But the problem that Israel had is the problem that the whole world has, because the whole world needs saving. Try and think back. Remember I mentioned a covenant curse. I said that when the Israelites disobeyed God, back in Deuteronomy, God said that there will be curses on the land. It's the natural product of disobedience. Unfortunately, we all live under a bigger curse. It goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden, where two humans left House of Bread in search of food, where two humans, Adam and Eve, chose to do what was right in their own eyes, and God cursed the ground, the whole world, because of it. We see this everywhere we look. We see it creeping into our bodies in illness and disease. We see it smashing the ground to bits in natural disasters. We see it in famines, just like in Ruth. Ultimately, we see it taking the lives of those we love. Because this world is cursed. Just like Naomi and her horrible situation, there's absolutely nothing we can do about it. There's no way of removing it by ourselves. Because we also see it slithering out of our mouths when we gossip about our colleagues or our neighbors. We hear it whispering in our ears, telling us that that person needs to pay for what they've done. We feel it coiled around our hearts, hardening us, making us prideful, cynical, bitter. And as much as we try to defeat it, we can't. We might make New Year's resolutions, but it's the 26th of January. I wonder how many of those we've already broken. I don't know, some people can't even look in the mirror because they're so ashamed. And we can get temporary cures for illnesses, but there's no cure for death. I've never met anyone who's come up with a cure for death. We need saving. Bury St Edmunds needs saving. Our world needs saving because there's a curse. And just like Naomi, we need someone to come along, to show us kindness, to rescue us from this curse with one massive act of hesed. And there's very good news for us this morning, Bridge Community Church. Remember I said earlier that the word hesed comes up about 250 times in the Old Testament. Well, most of these times, the word's describing what God is like. He is constantly said to be rich in hesed. In fact, that word kind of sums up his character. So Christians, what this means is that we have a God whose character is summed up by self-sacrificial, costly, loyal love. And what this means is that no matter, as much as we have created a cursed world for ourselves, as much as we deserve for it to be the way it is, God's hesed is not about what we deserve. And right at the end of the book of Ruth, sneak preview, we're going to see a preview. We're going to see a shadow of the hesed of God. Because right at the end, we're going to see that a king is coming. Ruth's going to have a baby called Obed. His son, Jesse, is going to have a child who's going to become King David. And during David's reign, there's going to be peace. There's going to be prosperity in Israel. There's going to be restoration to this broken culture. So in one great act of hesed, God is going to give his people what they don't deserve. Amazing. But it gets even better than that for us. Because 1,000 years after David, in the same little town called Bethlehem, God's going to show the true extent of his hesed. The final revealing of his character. He's going to show his self-sacrificial, loyal love. And in this act of hesed, this plan to redeem and restore the whole world, it's going to come in the form of a baby that you could have held in your arms. And then our God was so fully committed to hesed that he lived an entire human life under that same curse that we live under, with all of its suffering, all of its grief, all of its pain. And then we see an act of hesed that we will never be able to understand. We see the self-sacrificial loyalty of God in Christ as he's nailed to a Roman cross and murdered. As he receives the very worst effects of our sin. As he's broken, as he's bleeding, and as he dies. And on the cross, we see that while God may have pronounced a curse on creation, he never dished out what he wasn't willing to take himself. And he did this so that he could destroy it once and for all. So that we never needed to suffer like that. So that we would never experience the worst of it. Because in his resurrection, the worst of it was defeated. The curse was broken because Jesus defeated death. So we were just like Naomi. We were completely reliant on somebody else's kindness, on someone else's hesed, and he came. In the rest of the book of Ruth, we're going to see shadows of what Jesus has done. Because this is a book about the character of God. It's a book about how God intends to restore the world through men and women made in his image, committed to hesed love. So I hope that I've whet your appetite a bit for the book of Ruth. I hope you can already see that it's much, much, much more than just a historical romance novel. But what does this mean for us? What does this mean right now this morning for each of us in this room? I wonder if some of us feel a bit like Naomi this morning. I wonder if some of us feel like we've sort of walked into a tunnel. We thought we could see light at the end of it, but it's gone. And the light behind us has vanished. We feel completely helpless. The situation that we're in has no solution. We've been praying for years and we've seen no change. Addictions, patterns of sin that we're so ashamed about that we just want to hide from God and from other people. Some of us might be carrying sickness or pain or grief or anger. Some of us might have tried again and again and again to get better, to be better. We've made resolution after resolution after resolution. We're about ready to give up, to leave house of bread in search of food. Some of us might just feel surrounded by darkness. If this is you, I believe that God would say this: I have been separating light from darkness since day one. Jesus says, come to me. He says, I've been right there. He says, I know grief more deeply than you can ever imagine. He says, I know sickness. Believe me, I know pain and suffering. He says, I've lived under the curse of sin so that I could destroy it for you. He says, come to me, you who are burdened and heavy laden. Just come. Pam's going to keep playing for a bit as we take communion together. As we take communion, why don't you just pick up the elements? You can sort of try and balance them on your knees or something. As we take communion, I want you to think about this. Jesus Christ is the only person who can ever satisfy you. He's the only person who could ever save you. So come to him now. Eat his flesh. Drink his blood. Remember his forgiveness. Remember his hesed towards you as you come to him. So why don't we take the bread and remember that on the cross, Jesus' body was smashed to bits. And as it was smashed to bits, he took the worst of that curse. He defeated it. He's done that for us. So you can take the bread. As you eat it, as you kind of feel the roughness of the bread in your mouth, just remember the roughness of Jesus' body. As those nails smashed through his hands. As that crown of thorns dug into his head. That was for you. He took that curse. He took the worst of it so that you didn't have to face it. Let's eat. And then as we take the juice that kind of represents the wine at the Last Supper, as you drink that, just remember that this is Jesus' blood that was poured out on the cross. That his blood covers up all of your sin, all of those times when you feel that guilt, when you're too ashamed to even look in the mirror. This blood covers all of that stuff. So when God looks at you, he sees Christ. He sees Jesus. He sees that obedience. He sees that hesed. That's what God sees when he looks at you. He doesn't see a filthy sinner. He sees the righteousness of Jesus because of his blood. So let's drink that together and remember that. The rest of the bands are going to come up now. We're going to sing a couple of songs. If you feel that God has spoken to you this morning, if you want to receive prayer during this time, there's a few people around the room who would be very, very, very happy to pray with you. So I managed to rope my wife into this.